Hello everyone, it's Martin, aka Anders, and while in my last video we got to take a look at North America's metagame going into First Strike, now we get to look at the real deal. In today's video we're going to dive into the metagame of the NSG Gamers First Strike Open Qualifiers. Let's jump right in. To quickly recap, as well as clear up any confusion that there may be around First Strike's format, in North America there are going to be two major qualifiers, one hosted by NSG Gamers and one hosted by UMG. And in both of those events cases, they are the second stage of qualification, where there are feeder events that even lead up to those. For NSG Gamers, they held an open qualifier, which is what we're going to discuss today, and that was ultimately for seeding moving into their qualifier proper that will decide who they send forward. When we get to UMG, it's a little bit more complicated, but I'll cover that more in depth when we get to those events in a couple of weeks. Talking strictly about this NSG Open qualifier, it was played on patch 1.1, however there was no icebox allowed, and while the Sky patch was technically supposed to be pushed midway through the event, it was ultimately pushed back due to bugs, which I'm sure many of you are aware of. Looking more in the realm of results, this tournament started with a round of 128, but quickly whittled down to 32 that was predominantly composed of those we would expect, hosting all of the major Tier 1 teams, with no one of particular note being upset prior to that. That trend didn't last for particularly long though, as in this round of 32 there were a couple pairings that would definitely qualify as upsets by most people's interpretations. You had Immortals falling to the new X-Set roster, previously Pretty Boys and including Tier 2 staples like we did. You had Complexity, who has generally been underperforming relative to the expectation of their name, taking down the much hyped NRG roster. And Equinox Esports, formerly China Win, taking down FaZe Clan. The only upset throughout the rest of the tournament was Slimy Boogerman, yes, you heard that correctly, who dropped both Cloud9 White, the all-female C9 roster, in the round of 32, and then proceeded to also take down Built by Gamers in the round of 16. Where things got really interesting is when they even managed to take a map off of the Cloud9 Blue roster in the quarterfinals. Undeterred, however, C9 Blue would go on to beat TSM 2-1 in the semifinals, and ultimately win the grand final against Envy, also 2-1. Where from the top 16 onward, everything was technically only for seeding here. There was some speculation that certain teams weren't taking it as seriously and holding back some strats, but nonetheless, this was an incredible result for the C9 roster that has generally felt a little bit like a forever second, forever third team, at least thus far. With those formalities out of the way, let's get right down to the stats with the maps. Looking at map pick rates, we see a pretty noteworthy mix-up. Ascent has ascended, to the far and away most picked map in the North American metagame, and we see Haven, which is usually the clear second on the totem pole, dropping quite noticeably, so much so that it's below Split at this point. Split coming in at 23.8% edges out both Bind and Haven that take only 20% apiece. I have a bit of a working hypothesis on this, but it is 100% speculative and I have no concrete evidence to back it up, so take it with a billion grains of salt. I think that what we saw in the NSGX Renegades Invitational was that a lesser known, more or less not even established as a Tier 1 team come in, play Split, and beat down a bunch of Tier 1 orgs because of it. I think after that event, a lot of teams decided they needed to get their act straight on Split, and thus a lot of them were far more willing to play into it this time around. It's something that they not only now know how to play, but because they've learned how to play it in such a recent time frame, there's a non-negligible amount of recency bias that pushed this number up. Again, that's completely speculation, but in terms of logical deduction, I think it's a pretty sound reason why I think this happened. Hopping over to map skews, we see all of the patterns that we saw starting to develop in the NSGX Renegades event, defensive skews across the board. This lends a lot of weight and validation to the decision coming down the pipeline from developers to start hitting Sentinels and try to address map skew, because of just how universally defensive-sided it is. Given we have historically seen Haven as an offensively sided map, but at least in North America, and at least in the recent past, we've seen it still the closest to a 50-50, but leaning generally more towards defense than it has offense. With maps done and dusted, we're going to jump into the rest of statistics, and very much so like I did with the NSGX Renegades events, I'm going to be doing this by showing you the most played compositions, not agents, on a global basis throughout the event, and then going on a map-specific basis to get a better glimpse at what map-specific metagames might be starting to shape up to. Looking first at that top 5, we have some very welcome mix-ups. Comparing this to just my last video with NSGX Renegades, we first see some significant commonality, the first 2 compositions on the list being exactly the same. There haven't been gravitational shifts in the North American meta in the last 2 weeks. Who's surprised? That first comp raking in 15% pick, over a third of the overall Haven metagame, and boasting an actually respectful win rate, which isn't something we commonly see for these high prevalence compositions, with 52.5% win overall, and a win rate north of 55.5% on Ascent. Bouncing down to that second composition, again identical to where it was in the placings for NSGX Ren, with a 13.1% pick rate, just shy of 30% on Ascent. However, when we get over to win rate, it is that prevalent comps tending not to do well pattern, with only 46.6% overall, although a significantly more impressive 59.1% on Haven, although that is due to the fact it was very seldom picked on that map. When we get down to the third slot is when we start to see things get a little bit exciting. We actually didn't see a single Killjoy composition in the top 5 picks from NSGX Ren, and in here we see it already in the third slot up. With just under 9.5% pick rate overall, it's still a far cry from the top 2 teams. Nonetheless, it made up nearly a fifth of the overall split meta, and its win rate is the most impressive out of this top 5, with 59.1% overall and an incredible 63.6% on Ascent. Dropping down again, it's another one of the more common culprits, and this is actually the composition that seems to be the standard setup for split. With an 8.8% pick rate overall, it made up nearly as much of the split meta as the most played comp made up of the Haven meta, with 34.2% of the overall split setups. However, its win rate was absolute trash, 45.6% and 45.8% on split. This is another one of those cases where the standard most picked composition is generally not doing well, and this is no different story. The fact that this composition was picked so much but performed so poorly makes me want to tune my hypothesis on why split appeared so much a little bit. It begs the question, and at least indicates to me, that there was probably less of a willingness of all teams to play this map and more of a willingness of a small pocket of teams to play it repeatedly. When we look at NSGX Ren, it was a matter of not many teams, but just a few forcing it repeatedly that made it sort of come to the forefront. I think in this scenario, it was probably still only a few. Unfortunately, I don't have access to the information of which teams picked which maps. I just get to see which ones were played in the overall match set, but it would not surprise me in the remotest if it was 4, 5, or 6 teams that were just picking split over and over and over again using a specialized composition and running it into this setup, this standard split comp, and just mowing it down. Looking at this last one, it's actually no surprise that it's here in the 5th slot, because it is quite literally the Killjoy version of the most played composition, a carbon copy with Killjoy instead of Cypher. It comes in with a 7.5% pick rate, just over 17% on Ascent in particular. However, it is bottom of the barrel when it comes to win rate, with only 44.6% overall and only 45.4% on its best map Ascent. Jumping over to map specifics, we're going to kick it off with Ascent. Given that Ascent was the most played map in the tournament, it's not exactly shocking that the most played compositions on this are functional mirrors of a lot of what we just looked at for the overall most played compositions. The first most played on Ascent being the second most played overall, the second most played on Ascent being the first most played overall, and the third most played on Ascent being the 5th most played overall. All 3 of these appeared on that top 5 list. In spite of that, however, 2 out of 3 of these obviously didn't do particularly spectacularly. The first boasting only a 46.5% win rate, and the third with only 45.4% win. That second one is what we really should be honing in on here. 22.4% pick rate for this map in particular, and an impressive 55.6% win rate. Not only that, but another reason to hone in on it is look at the difference between it and that third comp again. The only difference is the Cypher versus the Killjoy, and yet there is a full 10% difference in their round win rates. That's absurd. I know that there were numerous high-profile teams who were willing to bring out the Killjoy variant of this composition, most notably 100 Thieves, and yet it would readily appear that teams just are not comfortable enough on Killjoy, or she just isn't naturally strong enough on this map for the case to be made. I've voiced my personal opinion numerous times where I think that if you're running Killjoy over Cypher and not in addition to Cypher, you're griefing. I'm not surprised by this at all. Now that might change after these coming Sentinel nerfs, but for now, I'm willing to stand by it. Now moving over to Bind, it's actually going to be the only case where the most played composition on a map wasn't horrible on it. We've got Cypher, Jet, Omen, Raze, and Sova in a dead heat with Breach, Cypher, Omen, Raze, Sova, both at 15.6%. The prior obviously performing significantly better than the latter, while the first has a 55.3% win rate and the second only has a 48.3%. Moving on to this third composition though, things get a little bit interesting. Obviously it is a Killjoy composition that isn't running Cypher. Given the words that just came out of my mouth, you might be a little bit confused by the fact it has a 58.4% win rate, which is absolute madness. Madness right up until you realize that this win rate is the way it is because of a 13-2 stomp that 100 Thieves laid down against Dignitas. With such small numbers in an event like this, a one-sided slaughterfest of that magnitude is going to warp win rates as much as 3 to 5%. Moving over to Haven, we see the usual suspects. In the top slot, the most played composition in the entire tournament at 34.4%, however with a much less impressive win rate of only 49.2%. In the second slot, we see, well, the exact same composition, but with Phoenix instead of Reyna, something that we've really come to expect on this map, as teams really tend to lean into Phoenix as a duelist of choice on this map. That comes in at 25%, a full quarter of all compositions played on this map, and a win rate significantly better than that top slot at just shy of 55%. In the third slot, however, we're going to see, very similarly to what we just saw, a clone of the second composition, but subbing in Killjoy over Cypher. And while this one would certainly fit my Cypher over Killjoy narrative a hell of a lot better than the last one, it's still subject to the same footnotes, where it was picked so lightly in a map that was already picked lightly in an event-wide basis. This 40% is almost guaranteedly the result of being on the bad side of a one-sided stomp. Whether that stomp was deserved or not, or a result of the compositions or not, is an entirely different question, but with a sample size of this magnitude, it is too tough to say. Moving on to the last map split, we've already discussed this a little bit so far. The top composition coming in at an impressive 34.2%, however struggling significantly, boasting a win rate of only 45.8%. The second two compositions on this list really being the heroes of the map during this event. That second composition, Breach, Jet, Killjoy, Omen, Raze, coming in with 18.4% pick and an impressive 57.1% win. And the final composition, identical but running Viper over the Raze, coming in at 10.5% pick and just shy of 55% win. In keeping with a recent topic of mine, I wanted to now take a look at the level of archetypal concentration that North America is starting to see. I've taken each of these maps and all of the compositions played throughout this event and stratified them down to what agents and agent combinations are really becoming the defining characteristics of the map-specific metagames. The results of that hunt was a pretty clear setup of four agent archetypes. For the sake of simplicity, at least until there's a more significant differentiation between the two other than team-specific preference, I've combined Killjoy and Cypher into a singular defensive site anchor sentinel slot. With that slot locked in, we see a very poor degree of diversity in compositional archetypes right now. For Ascent, we have Sentinel, Jet, Omen, Sova. For Bind, we see the same, but with Raze instead of Jet. For Haven, it is literally identical to what we have for Ascent. And for Split, we finally see a bit of a mix-up, but nothing significant, with still 3 agents of overlap, the sole addition being Breach over Sova. And you may be thinking to yourself, okay, cool, there are 4 agent archetypes that very clearly define each map, but just how bad is it? Well, the least effective of these 4 still accounts for over half of all compositions played on its respective map. For that Sentinel Jet Omen Sova combo on Ascent, it's nearly 3/4, on Bind it's half, on Haven it is almost all, and on Split it is still well north of half. I've already ranted for more than my share of time on my level of disapproval with the amount of compositional diversity in competitive Valorant right now, but it is still a topic I wanted to highlight here to keep it relatively front of mind and allow people to make their own decisions and informed opinions on how compositions are being played in this game right now and how they're forming around each map. And while I don't want to make this too long, there's one last thing I wanted to highlight before closing out this video, and that's born out of a line of conversation that Bach and Vansili had on broadcast. They were discussing Cloud9 Blue, the eventual winners of the entire event, and how they were no longer tens and friends. In the past, the roster before they had their locked-in team was both jokingly and quite literally referred to as tens and friends, poking at the fact that Tens, an incredible individual carry player, was performing at such a high level that it seemingly trivialized the contributions of his teammates. Bach and Vansili made the very accurate and well-needed clarification that that team is no longer tens and friends and that his teammates are doing a phenomenal job. However, I want to add a wrinkle to that. I think they're still tens and friends, and I think that's a good thing and something we should be taking notes on, and is in no way a negative attribute. Let's take a deeper look. Something that C9 Blue very frequently do is 4-1 splits. They'll put a singleton on one side of the map, have it fish for information, whether that be a Killjoy placing flank coverage, or a Raze boombotting out a main corridor. The idea is to gain information and apply pressure on one side of the map to both try to glean where your opponents are positioned as well as bait out rotations, while on the other side of the map they have a force stack that is prepped to not only catalyze and execute, but readily push themselves forward in front of Tens as sacrificial lambs to allow him to pop off.
Well, where you had Relics that was able to move inside the site when they were trying to force a rotate, when they tried to go for some heroic play for Envy towards that mid side to get more control, when they were already at a one-man advantage. I didn't like that play, but at least they were able to step back onto it for Envy to still hold that B side and also drop in a spike here earlier, or with the low time remaining.
We see here that the team pushed up for orb control because they're 1 point off of the Killjoy ultimate. The team pushes up in front of Tens, allowing access to B main with him at low risk, and then as soon as the Killjoy ultimate goes off is when they've engaged Tens and set him loose. They've done their job, they've put him in a position to succeed, and they let him go wild.
Twice dying.
That's a big orb pickup as it allows them to utilize lockdown. And you can see some damage being dealt there as well to Food, who's trying to spam through the wall. They're trying to take out that Killjoy ult. And they actually do have a player who's trapped in it. Food trying to get away, ends up getting gunned down. There's also a nano swarm in position.
One enemy remaining.
Yet again, Envy looks
Spike
soft
planted.
as Tens is popping off. It's down to now just one. It's Finesse who's hiding inside the dark cover. And yeah, there's Tens finding a 4K on the round.
And while that's only just one example of how a team can concertedly position their players and push through a map in such a way that their win conditions are preserved effectively, there's tons of other examples of how Cloud9 can leverage this in an effective way. Taking a look at this split example, it's a highlight of how that same sort of methodology of playing to your win conditions and enabling them to the best of your ability can be utilized on the defensive side of the map. If you look very closely at where Tens' Reyna is throughout this, you see that he is allowed to rotate at will to where the pressure of the opposing team is going. That enables him to be wherever he needs to be, when he needs to be there, and get the kills that net them the round.
We'll call it like the RC Cola of rifles. The Shasta, if you will. And we've got some Spectres in the mix. But again, slow off the bat. It's quiet. It's the calm before the storm currently in this first buy round.
Well, we'll start things off here with Caboose trying to get some sort of entry or some mid presence, but there's 3 players from Cloud9 just trying to work off a flashpoint later on, but Ascent going to peek out first. The first kill onto Mame, and he runs away with a dismiss, and they all fall back out of that one, playing the numbers on their side. So as we talked about, Envy liking to take control of mid side first and then go for some execution in the end. Well, they pay the price. Cloud9 reads into that and get the first kill. Now they stack the sites and have the numbers advantage.
10 still here. 10's just feeling it. Decides to just get aggressive. Throws down the Lear as well. Will dismiss away just in case there's another looming threat, but there's not. It's now down to 2 as Envy decides to head back over to A, where 10 has changed positions.
30
nice
seconds
shot
left.
Coming out from FNS, though. A quick flick over.
While this clip obviously went awry, it highlights how his team enables him to rotate to where he needs to be when he needs to be there. The fight goes down B heaven, he gets multiple kills, and instead of being one of the 2 players who drops onto site, he gets to flex into B heaven stairs and then end up on the opposite side of the map when they realize that the rotation is likely coming out. That's in spite of the fact that one of the 2 agents that were also there was a Breach who's phenomenal at retaking and also phenomenal at stalling. Intuitively, it would make a lot of sense to have the Breach move there as opposed to the Reyna, and yet they're still willing to commit to that game plan of playing to 10s as a win condition and allowing him to continue to pop off throughout a round. If we look at this next clip, it's the same principles at play. A team setup that allows 10s to play a high firepower pivot point to counter whatever the enemy is pushing with, and it goes perfectly this time around.
Have to be desperate with 10 seconds remaining to try to get into the round. And then Cloud9 just stopped them in their tracks as well on the A side. So that's 3 unanswered. And even when you looked at the first 2 rounds that were played here, Buck, Envy only had 1 kill off the pistol round and eco round. So now the economy is still not going to be right because they couldn't get any spike plans down either to add that 300 credits on each round.
Boost a little slow on the flick over. 10's had all the time in the world for that kill. And that sends Envy back yet again as they now try to go towards heaven. They're gonna have to deal with this Killjoy hardware. This utility coming out from Killjoy proving to be a serious nuisance for them as they try to work towards B. They're gonna have to wait for the Nano Swarm to dissipate. 10's is waiting around the corner. It's a great flash to get some setup, and he's just gonna stick around. Even though that healing ray gives away his position, he's stuck into the corner, and they don't even get a hard clear. 10's has a 4.
Alright, that will close us out for the open portion of NSG's First Strike Qualifier. Obviously, the closed portion is soon to follow, and something we should all be keeping track of, and something I'm certainly going to be covering once it's finished. In the meantime, though, question that I'd love to ask all of you is, do you expect there to be anything exciting coming out of that event? Obviously, we'll get exciting plays, we might get upsets here and there, but for the most part, I mean, we looked back at my NSGX Renegades video. The predictability of this metagame was very much so a case of reality paring expectations. There were a couple wrinkles here and there. We had teams like 100 Thieves who are willing to pull out Killjoy more than we necessarily expected, but for the most part, we have the tier 1 organizations that we expected, playing the compositions that were incredibly predictable, and it all kind of played out as many could have seen coming. Do we think that this closed qualifier is going to have a little bit more excitement to it? Do we think that teams may have been pulling punches a little bit and that there will be strategic flourishes to look forward to? Would love your guys' thoughts, because I will be completely blunt, when it comes to the excitement that North American Valorant brings to me at the moment, I would pretty much rather watch any other region. Sorry, not sorry. Per the usual, if you guys are enjoying my content, don't forget to like and subscribe. You can also find me all across the internet at AnderzzTV. Twitter, Instagram, Twitch, you name it, I'm probably on it. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.